You ever complain about your job? Maybe you hate your boss, or your back hurts, or the coffee machine at work is broken again? Yeah, we all have bad days. But tonight I want to take you somewhere colder, louder, smellier, and infinitely more stressful. A place where your job wasn't just exhausting, it could get you executed. Tonight, we begin with the forgotten voices of history. People whose jobs were so cursed, so miserable, that just surviving a single workday was a miracle. And we're starting with one of the most overlooked human loudspeakers of the medieval world, the town crier, the walking megaphone of misery. If you thought being forced to read the news every morning was bad, imagine screaming royal decrees in the pouring rain while people throw rotten onions at your head. So before we dive in, hit that like button only if your curiosity outweighs your comfort. And tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it? I love knowing who's wandering the halls of history with me at 2 a.m. Now grab a blanket, let the fan hum in the background, and get ready. This is going to be rough. Let's begin. Imagine this. You're in your late 40s, your knees creak every time you step, and the smell of the city has permanently taken up residence in your clothes. You didn't choose to be a town crier. No kid grows up dreaming of bellowing plague warnings in a square while livestock trample their boots. But here you are, chosen, not asked. Maybe you had a voice loud enough to startle horses. Maybe your neighbor complained you talked too much. Or maybe the magistrate just didn't like the way you looked and thought, let's give him something to shout about. Either way, one day you were a baker's apprentice or a candlemaker's helper, and the next you're being handed a scroll and a bell and told to announce the king's will, loud enough for every drunk in town to hear it. Congratulations. You've just become the mouthpiece of a monarch who doesn't even know your name. Being a town crier wasn't glamorous. It was grueling, humiliating, and often life-threatening. Your job wasn't just to talk. It was to scream with clarity and projection in weather that would send modern news anchors crying under their desks. Rain, keep yelling. Snow, better not let your tongue freeze to your teeth. Riot in the streets, keep that announcement coming or someone will report you for negligence. Because in the eyes of the crown, silence was a threat. If people didn't hear the decree, if the market didn't know that grain prices were doubling or the curfew was moving up an hour, then chaos could break out. And guess who they'd blame? You. The poor soul, with a cracked voice and soaked shoes, trying to sound regal while standing next to a dung cart. Now don't think for a second you gotta write your own material. You didn't get to ad-lib or toss in a personal greeting. Every word came from the scribe's desk, stamped with a seal and handed down through layers of bureaucracy until it landed in your chapped, calloused fingers. And heaven help you if you misread a line. Say 2 barrels of barley instead of 10? That's misinformation. You just created a riot. Say executed instead of exiled. You've now declared death on someone the king meant to banish. That's treason. And treason doesn't come with a slap on the wrist. It comes with rope. You weren't paid well either. Most town criers were compensated in crumbs and favor. A free mug of beer here, a crust of bread there. Maybe you were granted a ratty cloak to keep warm in winter. But coin, rare, and lodging. You were lucky to get a straw mat behind the guardhouse. Your nights were filled with the sound of soldiers snoring, dogs barking, and your own lungs wheezing from a day of public yelling. And you couldn't complain. No one wanted to hear the crier cry. You might think, well, at least they had some authority, right? Some respect? Wrong again. You were a tool. A living bulletin board that everyone loved to blame. Merchants cursed you for announcing tax hikes. Mothers wept when you read the conscription orders. Drunkards mocked your voice, children threw stones. If anything went wrong in town, people didn't write complaints. They shouted at you, and you had to stand there, straight-backed, projecting confidence you didn't feel, delivering words that weren't yours to people who didn't want to hear them. And then there were the messages you didn't want to read. Like public executions, or plague updates, or the names of families being evicted for debts. Announcing those wasn't just hard on the crowd, it was brutal for you. You'd step into the square, bell in hand, throat dry, and watch as a silence fell like fog. You'd see the faces of people you knew, Neighbors, friends, maybe even relatives, staring up at you, hoping you'd say it was all a mistake. And when you didn't, when you read those words, slowly, clearly, as required, you'd feel something inside you shut down. Because you weren't allowed to feel, not publicly, not professionally. You were a vessel, an echo, a reminder that power didn't come with compassion, it came with volume. Even off duty, you were never really off duty. The bell didn't come off your belt. The townsfolk didn't forget your face. You were constantly watched, whispered about, blamed for laws you didn't write. If a merchant's stall got taxed into oblivion, he'd scowl at you like you signed the scroll. If a noble's child got conscripted, you'd get spat at in the street. You were the messenger, yes, but in a world that hated the message, you became the target. And unlike the town's butcher or the shoemaker, you didn't have a shop to hide in. You were public property, the walking embodiment of control and compliance, a one-man parade of royal authority without any of the perks. People feared you, mocked you, used you, and then ignored you. Until the next announcement, until the next scroll, until the next dawn. And don't even get me started on the wardrobe. You didn't get armor or robes or anything dignified. You wore layers of wool and leather, stitched together like a rejected festival costume. It didn't matter if it chafed or stank or soaked up every drop of rain. What mattered was visibility. You had to be seen, like a caution sign with lungs. You were given a hat, maybe with a feather or a badge. Not to make you look important, but to make sure people could point and say, "There's the fool who told us the water's poisoned." So next time someone asks you to speak up or raise your voice or make a big announcement, remember the man who did it for a living, with nothing but a scroll, a bell, and a permanent seat at the town's collective resentment table. Now let's say you managed to survive your first year as a town crier without losing your voice, your sanity, or your footing on an icy cobblestone while yelling about a new grain embargo. You'd think maybe, just maybe, things would get easier. They didn't, because being a crier wasn't just about shouting words. It was about becoming the living embodiment of a kingdom's will. And kingdoms, as it turns out, have a lot to say. Especially when they're run by temperamental nobles who wake up angry because their porridge was cold or their dog barked at the bishop. These were people who believed information should be instant, and somehow that meant you had to be everywhere at once. One moment you were announcing a marriage alliance at the city gate, and 2 hours later you were sprinting to the docks to proclaim a new maritime curfew because some lord's cousin got seasick at sunset. There were no horses for you, no escorts, no trumpets to announce your arrival. Just your feet, your bell, and the ever-pressing weight of urgency breathing down your back like a second skin. The irony, the very people who issued the decrees had no interest in how they reached the people. To them, the chain of communication ended the moment the wax seal dried. After that, it was your problem. Lost in the woods trying to reach a village with a message about firewood taxes? Too bad. Bitten by a dog on your way to the ale festival to warn about counterfeit coins? Shake it off. Got caught in a mob that didn't like your news? You should have announced it more cheerfully. You weren't just a messenger. You were a lightning rod for public frustration. And the more unpopular the decree, the more dangerous your job became. Ever try explaining to a hungry crowd that bread rations were being cut in half because the castle banquet ran long? Let's just say you didn't get applause. And here's the kicker. Not all messages were delivered the same way. Some had to be sung. Yes, sung. In rhyme. Because apparently, some royal clerk thought turning a tax increase into a melody would make it less infuriating. Imagine that. Standing on a barrel in the marketplace, your throat already raw, trying to croon out a verse about livestock registration while a flock of chickens pecked your boots, and a farmer with 3 missing teeth shouted that your voice reminded him of his ex-wife. And you couldn't stop. You couldn't roll your eyes or curse under your breath or show even the slightest flicker of resentment. Because the guards were always watching. And if you slipped up, if your tone was too sarcastic, if you stumbled over a noble's name, if you accidentally emphasized the wrong word, you could be accused of mocking the decree. And mocking the decree meant mocking the crown. And mocking the crown meant prison. Or worse. Still think you could have handled the job? Let's talk about weather. You've never known true suffering until you've tried to recite a 500-word proclamation in a hailstorm while holding a frozen bell and blinking sleet out of your eyes. There were no rain delays, no cancellations. If the kingdom had a message, it went out no matter what. You didn't get a voice double or a backup. If your throat gave out, you were expected to mime, or worse, let a deputy, usually a constable with the vocal range of a drowning badger, fill in for you. And trust me, if he messed up, it would still come back to you. You were responsible for the message even when someone else delivered it badly, because in the eyes of power, there was no such thing as a system. There was only a scapegoat, and that scapegoat wore a feathered cap and carried a bell. And speaking of the bell, let's talk about the sound of your existence. That bell wasn't just a tool, it was your curse. Every time you rang it, people groaned. It was Pavlovian. Ring the bell, and instantly every merchant, every baker, every laborer in the square stopped what they were doing and braced for bad news. New levies, new curfews, new draft orders. The bell didn't mean salvation. It meant disruption. And the more you rang it, the more people associated your face with misery. Children would mimic your walk and shout nonsense. Elders would cross themselves when you passed. Dogs barked. Pigeons took flight. You were a walking omen, an audible reminder that peace was temporary, and change, usually unpleasant, was constant. But maybe the worst part wasn't the work. It was the isolation. You were everywhere and nowhere. Always seen, never heard, at least not as yourself. You knew everyone's names, but no one truly knew yours. People pointed, joked, sometimes even cheered when you delivered a particularly dramatic announcement. But none of it was for you. It was for the message. The words you didn't write. The thoughts you didn't share. You were a body, a mouth, and a bell. Nothing more. You ate alone, you drank alone, and when you got sick, which you did often because shouting in winter air tears through the throat like sandpaper, you suffered quietly, because the town only missed you when they missed an announcement. And if someone else took your place, they barely noticed. The voice changed, but the misery stayed the same. Some criers tried to make the role their own. They added flourishes, dramatic pauses, funny voices, a twirl of the bell. And sometimes that worked, for a while, until the wrong person got offended. A noble who didn't like his name mispronounced. A merchant who claimed your tone insulted his trade. A local priest who thought your voice echoed during his sermon. And then, you were reprimanded, publicly, or fined, or demoted to sanitation duty, which in medieval terms meant cleaning out public latrines with a wooden spoon. You had to walk a razor's edge every single day. Be memorable, but not offensive. Be clear, but not robotic. Be expressive, but not too expressive. One wrong syllable, and your bell could be silenced forever. Even when you weren't delivering bad news, you were still a target. Say a noble wanted to curry favor with the crowd. He might order you to deliver a speech about how generous he was. But if someone in that crowd disagreed, if their taxes went up or their roof fell in, they'd see you, not the noble. Because you were the one holding the scroll. You were the one they could reach. And in a world without Twitter or public forums, throwing a turnip at your head was the only form of civic engagement most people had. It didn't help that your messages often contradicted each other. On Monday, you'd tell the town there was plenty of wheat and not to panic. On Thursday, you'd announce rationing. On Saturday, you'd tell them the harvest was fine again. People started to suspect you were lying, or worse, that you were incompetent. But you weren't. You were just delivering chaos, one scroll at a time. And the more chaotic the messages, the more people turned their suspicion into anger. You became a symbol, not of information but of instability. And instability in a medieval town was like blood in the water. It drew out every kind of threat. And yet, you kept going. Day after day, scroll after scroll, bell after bell. Because what else could you do? You had no trade, no land, no title. Your voice was your currency, and your reputation, however miserable, was all you had. So you got up, you rang the bell, and you shouted into the void, hoping someone, somewhere, might actually listen. The life of a town crier was never quiet, not even in sleep. Long after the scrolls were read and the bell tucked beside a crust of bread on your bedside plank, the echoes stayed with you. The words you had screamed hours before would still be vibrating in your skull as you lay in a cold corner of some barracks, or worse, a stable with hay that smelled more of horses than harvest. Some nights you'd dream of silence, but even then your own voice would find you warped and angry, repeating words you never meant. You see, when you repeat royal orders long enough, they stop sounding like commands from above and start becoming ghosts that haunt from within. But let's talk about mornings. Because for a town crier, mornings didn't come gently. There were no sunbeams drifting lazily through open shutters. There were shouts from guards, clanging hooves outside, and the abrupt kick of a boot telling you the morning scrolls had arrived. You never knew what you'd be shouting until the parchment was unrolled. Some days it was harmless. News of a new bridge, a market relocation. But those were rare. Most mornings your scrolls were soaked with menace. Increases in conscription numbers, punishments for missing tithes, new punishments for breaking old laws, and it was your voice that carried those threats into the ears of people barely surviving as it was. You'd eat if there was time, usually a piece of yesterday's bread, dry and splintered at the edges. Then you'd wet your throat with a ladle of well water, check your bell for cracks, and march out into a square that never welcomed you. And here's something most never consider. You didn't just walk into town and start yelling. There was choreography. You had designated corners, optimal echoes, prescribed orders of announcement. Some criers carried whistles or horns to signal when the crowd had gathered. Others were forced to wait for the church bells to finish tolling before they could speak. And every delay meant more tension, more scrutiny, more chances for the crowd to turn. Sometimes you'd arrive at your post to find a festival in progress, with jugglers and minstrels and laughter bouncing through the alleys. And then you'd ring the bell and the music would stop, all eyes on you. And you'd see it in their faces, the disappointment, the fear, the barely disguised contempt. You were the bad news they couldn't ignore. You were the omen wrapped in human skin. On especially grim days, you were forced to read aloud the names of those condemned. Maybe it was a thief. Maybe it was a woman accused of sorcery. Maybe it was a farmer who couldn't pay his taxes. Their names, their crimes, their punishments, all declared by your voice. And as you spoke them, their families would be in the crowd. Mothers clutching children, brothers with clenched jaws, friends with eyes that burned. They didn't throw rocks at the judge or the guard. They looked at you. Because you said it, you made it real. Of course, you tried to tell yourself it wasn't your fault. You were just the carrier of the message. But there's only so many times you can shout someone's death sentence before it sticks to your soul. You start to wonder if your voice has become cursed, if every syllable you say brings another person closer to ruin. And the worst part? People begin to believe it too. Over time, townsfolk grew superstitious. Some would touch their children's foreheads when you passed, muttering protections under their breath. Others would spit near your feet to ward off bad luck. There were rumors that your voice could hex a crop, that hearing your bell at night meant someone would die by morning, that you were part of a dark pact with the royal scribes to keep the town in fear. And the more fear they projected, the more isolated you became. The market women who once offered a smile now turned their backs. The tavern keeper refused to serve you unless the place was empty. Children stopped mocking and started hiding. You became a shadow walking in daylight, a necessary evil in a world that hated necessity. But even shadows have rules. You couldn't disappear. You couldn't hide. If you missed a proclamation, if you were sick or simply too broken to shout, the magistrate would send guards. Not to bring medicine or sympathy, but to drag you from wherever you were and force the words from your lips. There was no sick leave, no reprieve. You were a voice, not a person. And voices don't get tired. At least that's what they believed. Eventually, some criers started to lose it. Not publicly at first. Quietly. They'd start mumbling phrases when no one was around, repeating names under their breath. Some stopped speaking altogether unless there was a scroll in hand. Others began whispering parts of their announcements in their sleep, like haunted storytellers whose minds refused to go quiet. And still, the bell rang. If you asked them what day it was, they often didn't know. Time blurred when each sunrise brought another announcement, another angry crowd, another storm of glares and muttered threats. Your life wasn't measured in seasons or birthdays. It was measured in proclamations. The week the Bakers Guild rebelled, the fortnight of sickness warnings, the month of the double tax decree. That's how you remembered your own life, not by what you lived, but by what you said. And the worst betrayal of all? When the crown turned on you. When, despite all your service, all your sacrifice, you found yourself suddenly accused of improper delivery or disrespectful tone. Maybe a noble didn't like your facial expression. Maybe a scribe heard you cough between lines. Suddenly, you were no longer the voice of the kingdom. You were a traitor to it. Just like that. No defense. No trial. One morning you were reciting royal decrees, and by sunset you were in the stocks, pelted with yesterday's food, your bell rusting at your feet, because you were replaceable. There was always another poor soul with a loud voice and empty pockets. And when you were gone, no one missed you. Not really. They missed the announcements, sure. They missed knowing what the crown wanted. But your face? Your name? Forgotten as quickly as the messages you once screamed. So you see, being a town crier wasn't just a miserable job. It was a slow erasure. Of self, of safety, of identity. You gave your voice to a system that never intended to give anything back. And when it was over, when the bell stopped ringing and the scrolls were passed to someone else, all that remained was a whisper, faint, fading, and quickly silenced by the next decree. Of course, the town crier wasn't the only person cursed by duty in the medieval world. Every society has its hidden laborers, those whose lives are bent under the weight of necessity, their roles essential, yet unrewarded. And if you think the crier had it hard, spare a thought for the gong farmer. A title that sounds almost whimsical until you realize it meant being the man responsible for removing human waste from cesspits and privies. That's right. While the nobles discussed poetry and lineage over roast lamb, and the merchants bartered loudly under woven awnings, the gong farmer was knee-deep in the underworld of medieval sanitation, his existence confined to the dark corners of society, where the smell alone could send a night reeling. He worked mostly at night, not because it was romantic or peaceful, but because no one wanted to see him or smell him. The town bylaws often required that waste collection take place after sundown to preserve the public decency, which was just a polite way of saying, we don't want to be reminded that we all defecate. The gong farmer's route was familiar. Narrow alleys, wooden trapdoors behind inns, small stone courtyards behind bakeries. He'd lift the lid to a pit and be greeted with the kind of stench that could make a rat weep. And then, with hands calloused from years of labor, he'd begin to shovel. Into barrels, into carts, into the belly of the city's forgotten system. He wore no mask. He had no gloves. The air around him thickened into something that clung to his clothes, soaked his skin, and refused to let go. He carried the scent of his work like a badge, only it was one that barred him from taverns, from churches, from public events. People would cross the street when he passed. Children would pinch their noses and laugh cruelly. No one asked how he was or where he lived or what he dreamed of. He was the ghost of necessity, the man who made the town livable by doing the one thing everyone else refused to even think about. And what did he earn for this sacrifice? Not much. Maybe a small wage from the town council. Maybe a corner of a barn to sleep in. Certainly no protection, no health care, no days off. If he got sick from the fumes, he was told to breathe through his mouth. If he injured himself hauling a full barrel of filth, he was told to work slower next time. But work never slowed, because people never stopped producing waste. Not the kings, not the scribes, not the children in the alleyways. Every person in the city relied on the gong farmer, and yet not one of them truly saw him. Some tried to wash the stench away, scrubbing their hands raw with cold well water, chewing herbs to mask the rot on their breath. But it never worked. The smell wasn't just on the surface, it became part of them. Embedded in every pore, every strand of hair, every fiber of cloth. And that stink followed them, even in death. No priest wanted to bless a gong farmer's body. No widow wanted to sit beside their corpse. In some places they were buried outside the town walls, as if even in death they might infect the sanctity of the living. And yet, like the crier, they kept going. Not out of pride, not even out of duty, but because there was no other choice. Because once the town labeled you a gong farmer, you were unclean. Not just physically, but socially, spiritually. You couldn't just quit and become a baker or a merchant or a blacksmith. You carried your past with you, in every wrinkle and every sideways glance. You were marked, permanently, by your service. But perhaps the cruelest part was that despite all this, despite the odor and the isolation and the unrelenting shame, the work mattered. Desperately. Towns that neglected their waste collectors suffered outbreaks. Fevers, rashes, plagues. When the gong farmer struck, refuse piled high in alleys. Diseases spread like wildfire, and the same people who mocked them began to panic. Suddenly, the man in the shadows became vital. And yet, once the crisis passed, the scorn returned just as quickly. The gratitude lasted until the air cleared. Then it was back to whispers, glares, and empty streets when he passed. You begin to see the pattern here. In medieval society, survival often depended on the very people no one wanted to acknowledge. The crier, the gong farmer, the rat catcher, each one playing a part in the kingdom's fragile balance. Each one ridiculed, mistrusted, even hated, for performing a role that kept the world from collapsing. And what did they get in return? A crust of bread, a stained bedroll, a nickname whispered in mockery when they walked by, and the knowledge that if they disappeared, no one would even say their name. Imagine living your entire life that way, needed but never wanted. You kept things running, you kept people safe, you carried the burden no one else could bear, but you were never offered dignity. You were told over and over again, in every sneer and every slammed door, that you were less. Not just less important, but less human. And still, they endured. They woke up each day and returned to their tasks, even when the world turned its back. They stood in the rain. They walked through muck. They raised their voices or lowered their buckets not because they believed in glory, but because someone had to. Because the kingdom ran on more than gold and gossip. It ran on the broken backs and silenced voices of the very people history would forget. But we're not going to forget them. Not here. Not tonight. Because their stories matter. Their pain, their endurance, their quiet, unwavering commitment. It all paints a truer picture of the past than any crown ever could. They were the ones in the background. The ones who never got the feast, the song, the statue. But they were there. And without them, the story collapses. So if you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever done a job no one thanked you for, if you've ever been judged for doing what had to be done, this history is yours. You're not alone. You walk in the footsteps of those whose names weren't written down, but whose footprints are still carved into the stones of every street, every alley, every forgotten tunnel beneath the grandeur. Because sometimes the strongest people are the ones no one remembers, but that ends here. Now let's shift the focus again. You've heard the voice of the town crier and felt the stench-stained weight of the gong farmer. But what about the sin eater? A job that sounds like the setup to a myth or a riddle, but was very real and profoundly haunting. Picture this. A man who made his living by consuming food that symbolically absorbed the sins of the dead. No, this isn't allegory, it's history. In rural villages scattered across early Europe, especially in the shadowy, fog-soaked valleys, there existed a role so spiritually fraught and socially reviled that even death didn't offer peace to those who bore its burden. The sin eater was not a priest. He had no holy collar or sanctioned authority. He wasn't paid by the church. In fact, the church loathed him. He was hired by desperate families, usually in secret, often for just a few coins and a crust of bread. Why? Because many feared their loved ones had died with unconfessed sins, too sudden an illness, too swift a fall, too much left unsaid. And in those moments, salvation wasn't sought through sermons or last rites. It was purchased quietly, through a ritual both simple and deeply unsettling. A piece of bread placed on the chest of the deceased, sometimes accompanied by a cup of ale, and then in front of hushed mourners the sin eater would consume it, symbolically taking the soul's burdens into his own body. No one thanked him. No one clapped him on the back or offered a kind word. They averted their eyes. They held their breath. Some would weep, not for him, but at the thought that this unclean man now carried the darkness of their loved one. They believed, with a terrifying certainty, that each bite he took weighed him down with evil, that with every sin he swallowed his soul became more tarnished. He was not a healer. He was a vessel for spiritual refuse, a walking grave for guilt. Imagine living like that, knowing that your presence was only welcome when someone died, that your job was to take the worst of humanity, its regrets, its lies, its violence, and carry it away in silence. Children were warned not to touch you. Priests refused you entry into the church. And yet when the hour grew late and someone's grandmother passed with blood still on her lips from a family feud or an unpaid debt, your door would be knocked upon, not because they believed in you, but because they feared what would happen without you. You didn't get to say no, refuse, and you could be blamed for the soul's damnation. Accept, and you paid with another piece of yourself. There was no win, no redemption, only accumulation, sin after sin, year after year, until you began to feel like the very breath you exhaled might poison the grass. Even the bread, your supposed payment, was viewed with suspicion. You had to eat it quickly, often alone, or else someone might accuse you of dark rituals or sorcery. Some villages insisted the food be burned after or buried. Others made you eat in front of the corpse, eyes open, so the spirit could see its sins being taken. It wasn't just a job. It was a ritual soaked in paranoia, guilt, and silent desperation. And then came the loneliness, because no one married a sin eater. No one invited him to feasts. He was a man who dealt with things the world wanted to forget. He saw death daily, but never with ceremony or compassion. He didn't get to cry or reflect or offer wisdom. He was given food. He ate. He left. And afterward, people whispered. Some said he communed with demons. Others believed he stored the sins like trophies, becoming more monstrous with each ritual. He wasn't feared because he was dangerous. He was feared because he was a mirror, holding up the worst of everyone else's lives, reflecting it back in quiet, shameful glances. You could live 30 years as a sin eater and die alone in a ditch. No priest would bless your corpse. No candle would be lit. In some places, your body wouldn't even be buried in the churchyard. It was considered unclean, a spiritual hazard to the pious dead. And yet, your work had saved more souls than any sermon. You had walked into grief-stricken homes, faced down mourning families, and taken their pain into your body. Not with judgment, but with quiet resolve. And when your time came, when you lay gasping in your final hours, no one came to eat your sins, because there was no one left willing to bear what you had borne. So what does that make you? A martyr? A fool? A necessary evil? Or perhaps something far more complicated, the invisible scaffolding that kept the fear of hell from collapsing an entire society. And again, we return to the same truth. The people who kept the world turning, who kept its moral and literal filth at bay, were the ones left outside its gates. Their work was too dirty to be praised, their presence too uncomfortable to be acknowledged. But when crisis came, when death arrived or disease spread or fear gripped the hearts of those who fancied themselves pure, these were the ones they called, always late, always reluctantly, but called nonetheless. That's the pattern, isn't it? Across role after role, story after story, era after era, a kind of tragic choreography. The noble class building temples and cathedrals to their virtue while pressing their sins into the mouths of men too poor to protest. And we, centuries later, rarely remember their names. We remember the kings, the generals, the saints, but not the men who shouted decrees into icy wind or shoveled waste into carts at midnight, or ate the invisible rot of the soul. And if you think that kind of thing ended with the medieval era, if you believe we've outgrown the practice of scapegoating those we rely on, you might not be looking closely enough. Because every age has its sin eaters, its town criers, its waste collectors. They're not wearing tunics anymore, but they're still here, still working, still surviving, often unheard, often unseen. So when you hear someone say, "It's just a job," remember that for some people, their job is a lifeline others step on just to stay dry. That behind every clean street, every organized town square, every crisis averted quietly in the night, there's someone whose name you never knew, whose face you've forgotten, but whose work held up the very world you walk through. Let's walk a little further down the forgotten alleyways of medieval life and meet another figure you won't find, carved into the cathedral walls or praised in a noble's memoir. The plague watchman. Not the doctor with the beaked mask, not the alchemist waving incense over the dead, but the quiet, pale-eyed man whose job was to lock infected families in their homes and make sure they stayed there until they either recovered or didn't. You see, when pestilence crept through the streets, cities didn't turn to physicians first. They turned to containment. That meant isolation. And someone had to enforce that. Someone had to nail the doors shut. Someone had to guard them day and night. That someone was the watchman. No mask, no magic. Just a hammer, a torch, and orders that were as heavy as they were heartless. Imagine that being your duty. Waking before sunrise to check the quarantine list. Finding the address. Marching through narrow streets as neighbors stared from windows, the air thick with dread. Then hammering shut the door of a house where children cried behind the boards, and a mother begged through the cracks to let her fetch water, just once, for her dying husband. And you weren't allowed to speak. Not comfort, not kindness, just orders, just the law. The townspeople hated you for it. And how could they not? You were the face of their terror, the instrument of separation, the last person they saw before darkness swallowed their homes. You might have once been a stable hand or a brewer's apprentice, but that didn't matter now. You were the plague's shadow, its walking warning sign. No one invited you to eat. No one helped when you passed out from heat or hunger. The same guards who handed you your orders wouldn't share their fire when the night got cold. And the irony? You weren't protected. Not truly. The plague didn't care that you were following orders. You breathed the same air as the infected. You touched the same latches, leaned against the same door frames. If someone inside coughed near a crack in the wood, that breath could be your death sentence. And when the fever came for you, no one came to your door with a lantern or medicine. You were simply marked, contagious, replaceable. Some watchman cracked. After weeks of locking doors and counting bodies, they began to speak to the dead. Whisper through door hinges. Leave bits of food when no one was looking just to feel human again. But if they were caught showing sympathy, it was over. Dismissal. Sometimes worse. Because empathy was seen as weakness, and weakness was a threat to containment. You had to be firm. You had to be silent. You had to disappear inside your duty. But the worst moments came not from strangers, but from friends. A former neighbor. A cousin. Someone you'd grown up with, now behind a door you were ordered to seal. They'd plead, remind you of old favors, call you by your childhood name, and still you'd raise the hammer. Still you'd drive the nails. Because if you didn't, you'd join them. Or worse, you'd be accused of spreading the plague. And then your door would be the one hammered shut. The mental toll? Unimaginable. You didn't get rest, you didn't get peace. Your sleep was shattered by phantom knocks, cries you couldn't unhear. And when the city finally declared the outbreak over, when the bells tolled for mercy and healing, there was no celebration for you. No thanks, no feast, just a clean tunic and another assignment. You weren't a hero. You were a reminder. And reminders of pain aren't welcome in recovery. Some watchmen vanished after the plague, moved to new towns under new names. Others stayed, but lived as outcasts, spoken of in low voices, avoided in public squares. People remembered the sound of nails against wood. They remembered the silence you offered when they begged for hope. And even if you saved them, especially if you did, they never forgave you for surviving what their loved ones didn't. Because that's another cruelty in this lineage of forgotten workers. Surviving isn't always rewarded. Sometimes it's resented. Sometimes the mere act of making it through the disease, through the filth, through the sorrow, makes people turn away from you, as if you've stolen something they lost. But let's not stop here. There's another role you likely haven't heard about. One just as cursed, the charcoal burner. At first glance, it sounds almost peaceful. A man alone in the forest, tending slow fires, shaping black fuel for the furnaces of civilization. But look closer, and you'll find one of the loneliest, most dangerous trades in pre-industrial history. Charcoal burners lived on the edge, literally. Their huts were built on the borders of society, in thick woods or on windswept hills, close enough to trees and far enough from people. Why? Because their fires burned constantly, for days, for weeks. Slow, smoldering piles of timber covered with earth and moss, releasing smoke and heat until the wood inside transformed into blackened fuel. And those fires? They needed constant watching, day and night, rain or shine. If the smoke turned white or the pile collapsed, the entire batch was ruined. So the burner stayed, alone, tending, feeding, shaping, talking to no one, seeing no one. Just the crackle of embers, the scent of burning pine, the distant rustle of creatures who had no interest in fire or fuel. Why did they do it? Because society needed heat. Blacksmiths needed fuel, bakeries needed fire, cities needed warmth. But few wanted to live with the soot, the smoke, the stench. So the charcoal burner became another ghost, another necessary presence kept at arm's length. And what did isolation do to a man's mind? After weeks without speech, some charcoal burners began to hallucinate. Others spoke only to animals. Some wrote verses in the ash or sang to the smoke. They weren't mad. They were lonely. Profoundly, crushingly lonely. And yet their product was vital. Every sword forged, every pot cooked, every plague burned out with flame. All of it owed something to their silence. They were paid in pittance. They bathed in creeks. Their hands were always black, their lungs always stained. And yet, when they came to town, people treated them like strangers, not quite human, dirty, other. Just another figure who kept the world warm without ever being welcomed into its warmth. And when they died, usually young, usually coughing, they left behind nothing but soot. No family, no legacy, no portrait. Just the memory of smoke trailing up from the hills, vanishing into a sky that never once looked down in gratitude. Now by this point, you've walked through enough of history's shadows to start seeing the pattern more clearly. The farther from power a person stood, the more likely they were to carry the weight of civilization on their back, and the more invisible they became in the process. Let's peel back one more layer of this old world's machinery and look at another unsung figure, one who didn't ring a bell, who didn't eat sins or shovel rot, but who endured a different kind of torment altogether, the leper messenger. You may have heard of medieval leper colonies, walled communities hidden on the outskirts of cities, where those afflicted with what was feared to be a divine punishment were locked away, marked as spiritually and physically unclean. But what you probably haven't heard is that these colonies still needed to communicate. Letters had to be delivered, requests sent, food deliveries coordinated, and so a new role emerged, not assigned but fallen into. The leper who could still walk, who could still speak clearly, who had the courage to leave the gate, became the colony's only voice. It's hard to imagine what that walk felt like. Down from the hill, across empty meadows, into the towns where people scattered like startled birds at the first glimpse of your tattered robe and the small hollow clapper bell tied to your wrist. You weren't allowed to speak unless first announcing your presence, not because you were rude, but because your voice itself was feared. The bell warned others, disease approaches, turn away, clear the path. And they did. Oh, how they did. Doors slammed. Markets fell silent. Mothers pulled children behind carts. You could walk a full street without seeing a face, only curtains twitching and the sound of retreating footsteps, and you were used to it. Because before you were a messenger, you were a patient. Before the bell was tied to your wrist, it was placed in your hand by a priest who didn't dare look you in the eye. You lost your home, your family, your future, all for the crime of a numb fingertip, a fading spot on your cheek, or a cough that lingered too long. The doctors didn't understand it. The priests feared it. And the people, well, they believed whatever horror stories spread fastest. So how did you become the one who carried messages for the very world that exiled you? The truth is, no one else would. Caravans didn't stop for lepers. Nobles didn't visit colonies. If a plea for food or medicine needed to reach the town, someone had to go. Someone had to bear the stares, the whispers, the rocks thrown by terrified children. And for every journey you made, the town grew colder. Doors were locked earlier. Notices posted warning of plague bringers. Some towns barred you entirely, forcing you to leave letters on a post and wait from a distance like an outcast feeding pigeons. And if the message was ignored, if your community suffered without supplies, no one answered for it. No one was held accountable. It was as if you had never come at all, but still you returned. Because your people, those inside the colony, needed you. Not just as a runner of errands, but as a thread to the world beyond the wall. You brought back not only food and medicine, but news, rumors, hope. And though they didn't cheer when you returned, they watched from behind the wooden slats, and they breathed just a little easier, knowing someone out there still walked for them. And every time you walked through those gates again, you felt the difference. Inside the colony, you were no longer feared. You were still one of them, yes. But you were also a lifeline. The closest thing to power anyone in that place could dream of. And that weight? It changed you. You became something more than a patient. You became memory's keeper, sorrow's runner, a living testament that exile did not erase usefulness. But there was a cost. There always was. The exposure, the strain, the endless reminders that you were not welcome. Many messengers broke down, refused to go, hid when the next delivery was due. And who could blame them? No armor shields you from 1,000 eyes silently wishing you would vanish. And those who didn't break? They simply hardened. Their faces became stone, their eyes unreadable, their hearts cautious with hope. And yet, even in the worst of it, some held on to dignity. They spoke carefully, walked with posture, wrote with elegance. Because they knew, perhaps better than anyone, that history forgets those who don't speak clearly, that the world moves on whether your bell rings or not. So you make it ring, again and again, until someone finally listens. Let's shift again. We've spoken much of men in these stories, but the medieval world had no shortage of forgotten women, and few were as misunderstood or mistreated as the alewives, women who brewed and sold beer, often from small homes, sometimes as widows or single mothers trying to survive in a world that gave them little else. At first glance, it might not seem like a cursed job. Brewing sounds cozy, domestic, like warm fires and mugs shared among friends. But in reality, being an alewife meant being constantly watched, constantly accused, and frequently punished. You were blamed for poor harvests if your beer ran thin. If a man got drunk and fought someone in the square, it was your fault for giving him too much. If a priest tasted bitterness in your brew, he'd call it sin in liquid form. And when your ale was too good, that was worse, because then you were suspected of witchcraft. Alewives lived in fear of rumors, of jealous neighbors, of men who didn't like that a woman could earn a living without asking permission. Their homes were rated under the guise of quality checks. Their measurements were scrutinized, their pricing questioned. They were expected to brew enough to keep the town content, but never so much that they looked prosperous. Success was suspicion. Scarcity was punishment. And yet their work was essential. Beer wasn't a luxury, it was a staple. It was cleaner than most water. It fed laborers. It soothed wounds. It calmed the dying. And it was these women who kept it flowing, who stirred heavy pots, who watched fermentation with a practiced eye, who carried barrels on backs not built for lifting. They knew the craft. They passed it on. And they endured the backlash. Some were dragged before local courts, fined for imagined crimes. Others were mocked in public, painted with images of pointy hats and twisted cats. Yes, the very origins of the witch stereotype are rooted partly in the imagery of successful brewing women. A tall hat, to be seen in markets. A cat, to chase mice from the grain. A cauldron for boiling the mash. What began as tools of a trade became symbols of fear, all because independence was deemed dangerous. But they kept brewing, even when their neighbors stopped speaking to them. Even when the church warned against women selling intoxicants. Even when their husbands left and their names were whispered like curses. They kept the beer warm. They kept the town fed. They stayed. Because like every figure we've explored so far, the alewife represents a truth history rarely likes to admit. That the people holding society together are often the ones it's most eager to tear down. Now, as the tapestry of these forgotten lives stretches wider and darker, it's important to pause and ask, what kept them going? What made a leper messenger lift their bell again, or an alewife light her fire the next morning, or a charcoal burner step back into the smoke? The answer, strangely enough, wasn't always hope. Sometimes it was stubbornness, sometimes fear. Often it was habit, doing what you did because not doing it meant facing a different kind of death. The quiet kind. The erasure kind. The kind where you vanished from memory even before your body gave out. But there were other roles, subtler ones, that never made it to church records or family crests, yet whose absence would have shaken kingdoms. Consider the letter illuminator's apprentice, a role wrapped in ink and silence. You weren't the monk with status or the scribe with his own desk. You were the second hands, the shadow. The one who stayed after dusk, bent over scraps of parchment by candlelight, grinding pigment from stone and bone just to color a single decorative letter that someone else would take credit for. These apprentices lived in near constant quiet. No laughter, no conversation, just the soft scratch of quills and the endless patient burn of wax. Their eyes grew weak early. Their backs ached before 30. Their fingers were always stained, not with the vibrant reds and golds the manuscripts displayed, but with the black oil of soot and crushed beetle shells. They inhaled powdery minerals, swallowed air thick with lamp smoke, and squinted until their vision blurred permanently. And what was their reward? To be overlooked. The senior scribes signed their names to the final folio. The nobles paid the monastery, not the boy who mixed the ink. And yet it was these apprentices who created the brilliance, the borders of vines and birds, the fantastical beasts that danced around verses, the delicate initials that glowed like stained glass on a page. They weren't just workers, they were artists. But the world never saw them. They were told to copy, not create, to replicate the style of the master, to mimic without deviation. Any flourish too bold, any detail too inventive could be erased, or worse, called a distraction. Imagination wasn't celebrated in the scriptorium. It was corrected. So they learned to pour their creativity into tiny margins. A hidden fish in a swirl of ivy. A smirk on a cherub's lips. A bird with human eyes, tucked into a corner. Rebellion made miniature, meaning encoded where only other illuminators might notice. And still, they stayed. Night after night. Candle after candle. Because even if the world didn't value them, the work itself did. The page welcomed their touch. The letters whispered their own kind of thanks. And in that, some found enough to keep going. Then there were the tower bell pullers. Yes, real people whose only job was to climb hundreds of steps, often several times a day, just to pull ropes connected to massive bells that marked the passage of time for everyone else. There were no mechanisms, no gears, just brute strength and rhythm. And while the town heard beauty, what the bell pullers felt was pain. Raw palms, dislocated shoulders, knees that gave way on frosty ladders, and the knowledge that no one ever looked up to see who was keeping the hours alive. These weren't positions of honor. They were punishment. Many pullers were orphans, debtors, or injured laborers who couldn't return to the field but could still pull a rope. They weren't allowed to live near the altar or feast with the clergy. They slept near birds and bats, on splintered boards, shivering through winters, overheated in summers. And they weren't thanked. They were noticed only when the bells were late or silent. But they knew the sound of their labor echoed. That lovers met under the noonday bell. That merchants closed stalls when they heard the evening toll. That prayers began and meals ended on the rhythm they kept. And in that rhythm they found meaning. We tend to think of history as a grand stage where only the kings, queens, and warriors matter, where the ink belongs to generals and the light belongs to saints. But the truth is, and has always been, that history is built in the margins, by the hands you don't see, the voices you don't hear, the lives you forget to ask about. Even executioners, those most feared and hated, lived in that same margin, not as monsters but as exiles. Their names were never spoken in public. They weren't permitted to live inside the city. Their children were denied baptism in some towns. And yet when judgment was passed, the crowd demanded justice be carried out swiftly and precisely. And when it wasn't, blame fell on the man holding the axe, as if his hesitation made death more painful, as if his accuracy turned cruelty into order. Executioners didn't volunteer. Most inherited the role from a father, or were forced into it after committing a crime. And once marked, they could never escape. Even if they laid down the blade, the townspeople remembered. The whispers followed, the rumors grew, and so they stayed at the edge of town alone, living between fear and necessity. Some tried to hold on to humanity. They prayed before each sentence. They read psalms. One executioner is said to have wept openly during every hanging, even as the crowd jeered. Because he wasn't cold. He was trapped, punished by the very law he served, never allowed to forget what he had done, even when he did it well, even when it spared pain. And in that space, between duty and damnation, you begin to see the full shape of medieval injustice, that those closest to power were never the ones burdened by its darkest tasks, that the dirtiest jobs were handed to those with no protection, no voice, no lineage. And when the job was done, they were discarded like broken tools, or remembered only in nightmares. This is the quiet horror of history. Not the wars, not the plagues, not the burning towers, but the people who survived it all, uncelebrated, unnamed. The ones who kept the wheels turning even as those same wheels crushed them underfoot. But don't mistake this for defeat. Because while the world tried to erase them, they carved themselves into the corners, into the folds of letters, into the edge of bells, into the margins of manuscripts and memory. And here, tonight, their stories rise again, not as whispers, but as a chorus. So what becomes of a world that is built on the shoulders of the unseen? What happens to a society that demands everything from its most vulnerable and offers nothing in return but silence? You might think these were just isolated tragedies, small pockets of injustice scattered across centuries like forgotten graves. But in truth, these were patterns woven into the very fabric of medieval life, reinforced by custom, superstition, and fear. And the more you look, the more roles you find. Not just loud and dirty jobs, but quiet, invisible ones. Burdens passed down like heirlooms, not because they were treasured, but because no one else wanted to touch them. Think of the midwives, for instance. The women who brought life into the world while constantly standing one step away from being accused of ending it. They knew the rhythms of childbirth better than any physician. They understood when a cry was strong or weak, when a pulse fluttered with danger, when herbs might save a life or make things worse. They delivered babies in cottages with leaking roofs, by candlelight, surrounded by fear and screaming and prayer. They used clean cloths when they had them, river water when they didn't. And when the birth went well, they were thanked with bread and blessings. But when it went badly, when the child didn't cry, or the mother bled too long, the blame fell on them. They were seen as powerful, but not in a way that inspired trust. Their knowledge was unnatural, some said, dangerous. And when the church cracked down on witchcraft, midwives were often the first to be accused, not because they cursed anyone, but because they knew too much. They had seen too much. They had helped too many women survive what should have killed them. And survival, in a superstitious world, was suspicious. Some were forced to confess under torture, others vanished. But those who remained learned to walk carefully, speak softly, keep their knowledge folded tight inside their chests. Because one wrong word could bring fire. And yet they kept helping. They kept delivering life into a world that never welcomed them. Because they knew someone had to. Or take the millstone turner, the man whose only job was to keep the great circular stones of the village mill aligned and moving. It sounds simple, mechanical. But imagine the pressure. Every family in the town depended on that flour. Every harvest season became a countdown. If a stone slipped or cracked, grain spoiled. If grain spoiled, bread vanished. And when bread vanished, anger rose. He worked in choking dust, his hands coated in fine powder that seeped into every pore, every breath. His skin cracked from the grinding. His ears rang from the groaning gears. His joints stiffened before his 40th year. And when something went wrong, he was blamed before the machinery. He didn't get the luxury of error. His work fed the village. His failure starved it. No statue was ever carved for a millstone turner. No song ever sung. But their rhythm was the heartbeat of the town, just as the bell puller marked its time, and the town crier its orders. All these people moved in a choreography that no one acknowledged but everyone depended on. And perhaps the saddest truth is that most of them didn't even see themselves as remarkable. They didn't consider their lives tragic or noble. They thought of themselves as necessary, and that was all. There's something deeply human in that. The way people accept their suffering, not as injustice, but as inevitability. The way they keep moving forward, not because they believe in reward, but because the world would break without them. But should that be enough? Should survival in obscurity be the only reward for carrying civilization's weight? We tell stories of kings and saints because they left behind gold and sermons. But we forget the voices swallowed by mud and soot and silence, the hands that built what others claimed. It's time to remember them not as curiosities or cautionary tales, but as architects of the world we inherited. They were not supporting characters, they were not background noise. They were the infrastructure of survival, the ligaments holding a kingdom's muscles together. And now, centuries later, when their names have been erased by time, it is up to us to speak for them. Because history isn't just about dates and crowns and battles. It's about labor. It's about breath. It's about the man who stood at the town gates reading a decree with trembling hands. The woman who boiled herbs at midnight and prayed for a heartbeat. The child who carried firewood up a bell tower so someone else could ring it. These were the real acts of bravery. Not on battlefields, but in kitchens, in alleys, on rooftops, in cellars. Quiet places where no one watched, until everything went wrong. Let us not mistake their silence for insignificance. Let us not confuse their invisibility with irrelevance. The very opposite is true. Their absence from monuments is proof of how deeply they were feared, needed, and ignored. And so, if we are to understand the past, not the sanitized version, not the gilded fables, we must begin with the shadows, with the footsteps that passed through dirt, not marble, with the eyes that never met a king's, but saw everything that mattered. Their stories were never written in books, but they were carved into doorways, sung in lullabies, etched into the daily rituals of people who lived hard, worked harder, and rarely, if ever, asked for recognition. But that recognition is long overdue. And here in this space, under the soft glow of curiosity and care, we offer it, not as charity, but as justice. So if you've come this far, if you've walked these dark corridors with me, then you too are carrying part of their memory now. You've heard the bells, you've smelled the smoke, you've seen the ink-stained hands and the soot-covered faces. They are no longer lost. Not entirely. They live again, in your imagination, in your empathy, and maybe, just maybe, in the way you see the world tomorrow. Because behind every clean floor, every delivered package, every voice that says, "Here's what happened today," there's a lineage. A direct line to the plague watchman, the gong farmer, the sin eater, the bell puller. Their blood flows through the delivery driver, the janitor, the nurse pulling another double shift. And when we forget them, we are not just dishonoring history, we are blinding ourselves to the present. And now, after walking miles through the dust of forgotten lives, after hearing the footsteps of the invisible and feeling the ache in the bones of those never granted a name in history books, we arrive at the quiet truth that binds them all. The greatest acts of human endurance rarely wear crowns. They don't ride into battle with banners. They don't sign treaties or pose for statues. They scrub the floors of palaces they'll never step inside. They guard the doors of houses that won't remember them. They carry the weight of other people's sins, fears, griefs, and somehow still manage to stand. That's what this journey has been. A descent, not into darkness, but into the foundation, into the people who were never meant to be remembered, but whose presence is stitched into every page of the world we live in. The voices that echoed through town squares and across plague walls, the hands that shaped ink into meaning, soot into heat, herbs into hope, the eyes that saw what others refused to see, and kept seeing long after the rest of the world turned away. You see, the lie of history is that it's a story told by the powerful, but the truth is it's built by the tired, the unthanked, the ones who got up anyway, who worked through the pain, through the mockery, through the humiliation and silence, not because they believed they'd be remembered, but because they knew someone had to do it. They were the scaffolding beneath the spectacle. And even when the towers collapsed or the kingdoms fell, their labor remained, quiet, steady, unseen. And maybe that's why their stories hit us harder than the grand ones, because we've all felt a piece of that burden, haven't we? Maybe not in the mud of medieval streets or beneath the lash of feudal law, but in our own way. Working a job that grinds down your soul, carrying emotions no one acknowledges, showing up again and again because life won't wait for you to rest. That's the connection. That's the echo. We recognize them because we've lived fragments of their lives. So let this video not be a eulogy, but a revival. Let it be a small fire carried forward into your day, your memory, your conversations. Because these weren't just medieval miseries. They were testaments to a kind of courage most history ignores, a courage without applause, without witness, the kind that exists not in moments but in decades of silent resilience. And now I turn to you, not as a narrator, not as a voice in the dark, but as a fellow traveler through these forgotten rooms. If something in this journey stirred something in you, I invite you to join this growing community of people who care about the past, not the sanitized one, but the real one, the heavy one, the human one. If you haven't already, I warmly invite you to subscribe to the channel. Not because it helps an algorithm, but because it helps keep stories like these alive. Because every subscription is another candle lit in honor of someone history left behind. And I want to build a space with you. A space where stories don't have to be shiny or royal to matter. Where they can be hard, messy, honest, beautiful in their raw truth. And please, don't let the conversation end here. Scroll down to the comments and tell me, what did you feel during this video? Was there a job, a story, a figure that reminded you of something in your own life? Maybe you've worked a job where you felt invisible. Maybe someone in your family did. Maybe you felt the weight of being needed and forgotten at the same time. Share it. This space is for you, for us, for everyone who knows that just because something isn't in a textbook doesn't mean it didn't shape the world. Tell me what you learned. Tell me who you thought about. Tell me which story stuck with you and why. I read every single comment. I mean that. This isn't just a monologue. It's a gathering. A place to remember together. And if you know someone who might need this, someone tired, someone feeling unrecognized, someone wondering if they matter, send them this video. Let them walk this path with us. Let them see that history isn't only glory. Sometimes it's survival. And sometimes that survival is the most sacred story of all. So, until next time, wherever you're watching from, whatever time it is, whatever kind of day you've had, know this: you matter. Your story matters. And I'm honored you chose to spend your time here. walking through the shadows with me. I'll see you in the next one. Take care and carry their stories forward.